The wedding dress had taken 6 months to make. Seline ran her fingers along the embroidered hem as she stood outside the chapel doors, listening to the rain drum against cold stone. Inside, candles burned in her honor. Flowers had been arranged by hands that wished her well. Everything was ready. Everything except her heart. She had tried, she told herself. She had tried to love Garrett the way a bride should love her groom, with reckless, consuming abandon. But loving Garrett had always felt like warming herself by a single candle in the heart of a blizzard. Pleasant, perhaps. Insufficient, certainly. Barely enough to prove a flame existed at all. Tomorrow morning, she would become his wife. Tomorrow morning, she would belong to someone who had never once looked at her as though she were something worth keeping. She pressed her palm against the chapel wall and breathed. The stone was wet with condensation, slick and ancient beneath her fingers, and the smell of approaching rain filled her lungs like a warning she did not know how to read. The night felt heavy, too heavy, as though something enormous pressed down on the world from above, something that had not been there yesterday. Seline told herself it was nerves. She turned away from the chapel doors and walked toward the garden, the one place in all of Hartwell where she had ever truly felt alone. The flowers were wrong for the season, forced into early bloom by the strange warmth of the past week, and they swayed in the rising wind like mourners gathered at a pyre. She liked them better in the dark, less accusatory. She was halfway down the path when she heard them. The sound was low at first, barely a whisper carried on the wind. A woman's laugh, breathless and furtive. A man's voice answering in a register she recognized the way her bones recognize cold, deeply, wordlessly, without conscious thought. Garrett. Seline stopped walking. Her hand found the stone bench beside the path and gripped it without permission from her mind. The garden had a hidden alcove at its far end. She knew it intimately, had sat within it 100 times, reading or hiding from her mother's matrimonial scheming. She knew the way the ivy grew thick over the archway. She knew the way sound carried strangely there, amplified and close, like a confession spoken into cupped hands. She had never brought Garrett to that alcove. Someone had. Her feet moved before her mind gave the order. She knew she should have turned back. Knew it with every deliberate step, with every heartbeat that remained, terrifyingly calm. But some methodical, merciless part of her needed to see, needed the wound to be unambiguous and concrete, so that later, in the weeks of quiet devastation that would follow, she could not soften it in memory. The ivy parted at her touch. Faye's golden hair was unmistakable in the moonlight. Her sister who had wept at the fitting for this very dress, who had sewn 3 of the pearl buttons with her own careful fingers, saying she wanted to be part of the happiest day of Celine's life. Faye, who had embraced her just this morning and whispered that she would be the most beautiful bride Hartwell had ever seen. Faye. And Garrett. The world did not shatter the way Seline had always imagined betrayal would feel. It did not explode or fracture with cinematic violence. It simply contracted, quietly, completely, like a fist closing around the last breath of something that had been slowly dying for a very long time. They separated, pulled apart with the clumsy guilt of people not yet practiced at their sin. Garrett's face went white, then red, then settled into something Seline had never seen there before. Naked, unmistakable relief. Relief, as though he were the one who had been waiting to be free. Seline, Faye whispered, reaching out with hands still warm from a borrowed warmth that was not hers to hold. I can explain. Don't. One word. That was all she could manage without the composure she had spent a lifetime building, finally, publicly, coming apart. She turned and walked away, slowly. Each step deliberate, the way her mother had taught her when she was very young. Spine straight, chin level, heels soft against stone. A lady does not run, her mother had said. A lady walks through her pain, as though it is simply a room she is passing through, not a grave she is falling into. She walked, through the garden, past the chapel, through the iron gate at the estate's edge, into the darkness beyond the last torch, into the forest that bordered the northern hills of Hartwell, where the trees grew so dense that rain could not fully reach the earth, where the sound of celebration from the hall faded into something distant and entirely irrelevant. She walked until she could no longer walk, and then she sat. The forest floor was cold beneath her wedding dress. The embroidered hem, the one she had admired less than an hour ago with something approaching tenderness, was soaking now, darkened with mud and the particular, soundless grief that has no name. She pressed both hands over her face and allowed herself, here in the dark where no one could see, to finally break. Her shoulders shook. 6 months of arrangements, of fittings, of her mother's careful hope and her own quietly desperate wish that she had simply been wrong about the emptiness she always felt beside him. All of it. Reduced to this. A woman alone in a forest, in a dress no one would ever see her wear. Then, a shift in the air. No cracking branch, no rustle of leaves. Nothing that should have been a warning. Only a sudden weight, a darkening of the dark itself, as though the forest had drawn a breath and refused to release it. The temperature dropped, not gradually, not the way cold moves through open windows or beneath doors. It fell. Immediate, total, predatory, and her skin prickled with something that was not entirely fear, something she had no name for, something that felt ancient and impossible, and entirely too close. And then a voice, low, absolute. The kind of voice that did not ask permission from rooms or silences. It simply occupied them, the way stone occupies earth, the way dark occupies the space where light has surrendered. Why is a woman in a wedding dress, crying alone in my forest? Seline raised her eyes. The man standing at the tree line was not a man the way Garrett was a man, slight and careful and made of borrowed confidence. This was something else entirely. Tall enough that the shadows pooled differently around him, broad through the shoulders in the way of something built for endurance rather than elegance. His eyes caught the faint moonlight filtering through the canopy above, and they were gold. Not brown, not amber. Gold, luminous and unblinking, and trained on her with an attention so total and so still that she understood, in the primal, wordless part of her mind that had kept her ancestors alive through far worse nights than this. That she was not alone with a man. She was alone with an apex predator, and he was looking at her as though she were the only thing in the forest worth finding. Seline did not scream. She had always believed, in the abstract way one believes in things never truly tested, that she would scream, that the instinct would override thought entirely, would simply take her voice before her mind could intervene. But looking up at the figure standing at the edge of the dark, she found her voice had not abandoned her. It had only gone very, very quiet. As though it understood that sound here, with him, would change something irreversibly. He had not moved. That was the most unsettling thing of all. The absolute, predatory stillness of him. Men shifted their weight. Men fidgeted, breathed visibly, betrayed their uncertainty through 1,000 small and unconscious motions. This man stood the way old trees stood, rooted and patient and entirely unimpressed by weather. The gold of his eyes had not wavered. "You're trespassing," he said, and it was not an accusation. It was simply a fact being placed between them, the way one might set down a stone to mark a boundary. Seline's hands pressed flat against the cold ground. The mud beneath her palms was real. The ache in her knees was real. The ruin of the dress she had spent 6 months waiting to wear was absolutely, catastrophically real. She held on to all of it. "I didn't know this forest belonged to anyone." Something shifted in his expression, not softening, nothing as forgiving as that. More the way a predator adjusts when its prey unexpectedly holds its ground. A recalibration. He tilted his head the smallest fraction, and the moonlight caught the sharp line of his jaw, the deliberate brutality of a face that had been carved for intimidation and had never once apologized for it. "Everything in these hills belongs to me," he said. "Has for longer than your village has had a name." She should have been afraid. She was afraid. That would be dishonest to deny. But beneath the fear was something else, something infuriatingly inconvenient that she recognized as the specific recklessness that grief occasionally produces in otherwise sensible people. The feeling of having already lost everything worth protecting. "Then I suppose you can add one ruined wedding dress to your inventory," Silence. He crossed the distance between them in 4 steps. No hurry, no aggression, simply the unhurried movement of something that has never needed to rush, and crouched before her with an ease that was almost elegant, bringing his face level with hers. This close, the smell of him reached her before anything else. Dark forest and cold iron, and something beneath both of those, something older and wilder that she had no language for, that bypassed language entirely and spoke directly to the oldest part of her nervous system. She forgot, briefly, what she had been crying about. His eyes tracked her face the way she imagined a physician might examine a wound, not with warmth, but with complete attention, the kind that sees through performance entirely. She felt, absurdly, that he was reading something in her expression she had not given him permission to read. "Who did this to you?" Not a question. The phrasing of a man who had already decided there would be consequences, and was merely collecting the name required to deliver them. "No one did anything to me," Seline said. "People simply made their choices, and I made mine." Those are not the same thing. She opened her mouth to answer, and then he reached out, and his thumb brushed the line of her cheekbone where the tears had dried to salt, and the world stopped. Not metaphorically, not in the soft romantic sense she had read about in the books she kept hidden beneath her mattress. The world stopped the way it stops when you step from solid ground and find only air, a vertiginous, breathless suspension where physics pauses to reconsider its commitments. The touch lasted less than a second. It was barely a touch at all. It felt like being claimed. She pulled back. He let her, immediately, without resistance, as though he had already taken what he came for. But something in his jaw had tightened, and his gold eyes had darkened to something closer to amber, and she had the distinct, inexplicable impression that whatever had just passed between them had surprised him quite as much as it had destroyed her. He rose. "You cannot stay here." "I'm aware of that. The forest is not safe after dark, not for humans." The way he said humans, with that slight pause before the word, that fractional weight, caught in her chest like a splinter. "And what are you?" she asked, "if not human?" The gold returned to his eyes slowly, like dawn filling a room. He looked at her for a long moment, and she had the bewildering sensation that he was deciding something, not about what to tell her, but about what to do with her. As though she had become, in the space of 5 minutes, a problem he had not anticipated and was now deeply reluctant to put down. "Something you should not have found." He reached down and took her hand, not gently, not roughly, but with the absolute matter-of-fact certainty of someone who has never once doubted that the world will arrange itself to his preference, and pulled her to her feet as though she weighed nothing at all. The contact lasted 3 full seconds. 3 seconds was enough for the heat of his skin to register completely against her cold fingers. Enough for her to notice that his pulse, pressed briefly against her wrist, did not beat the way a man's pulse should beat. Slow. Impossibly, inhumanly slow. "Walk," he said. "I'll show you the road." She walked, and did not notice, until they had gone 20 paces into the dark, that he had not released her hand. He walked as though the dark obeyed him. Not as though he knew the forest well, though he clearly did, navigating the uneven ground with a certainty that required no hesitation, no searching, no adjustment. It was something beyond familiarity. The shadows seemed to part for him, to draw back a fraction at his approach, the way lesser things make room for something that has never learned to ask permission. Seline was aware, with every step, that she was still holding his hand. She had decided, approximately 30 seconds after noticing this, that releasing it would require acknowledging it. And acknowledging it would require a conversation she did not have the architecture for at present. Her heart was already doing something architecturally unsound. The rest of her could not be trusted to perform under pressure. The trees thinned gradually as they walked, the canopy opening in slow increments until the rain reached them, soft at first, then steadier, the kind of rain that commits. It caught in the dark waves of his hair and ran along the severe line of his jaw, and he did not appear to notice it at all, the way statues don't notice weather. She noticed everything. She noticed the way his hand completely enclosed hers, warm, dry, impossible in the cold. She noticed the unhurried rhythm of his breathing and the complete absence of the small, uncertain sounds that people make when navigating darkness. She noticed the way the animals of the forest went silent in a radius around him, not the silence of absence, but the silence of attention, as though every living thing in these hills recognized the hierarchy his presence established and responded accordingly. "How far does your land extend?" she asked, because silence between them felt less like peace and more like pressure. "Far enough that you would not have found the edge before morning." "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed without particular concern. "It isn't." She looked at the side of his face, the clean, brutal line of it against the gray of the rain, and felt the grief of the evening rearranging itself strangely inside her chest. Not diminishing, nothing as merciful as that. Simply repositioning, making room for something else that was warm where the grief was cold, that moved where the grief was still. She resented it immediately. "I should thank you," she said, "for the escort. I'm certain I would have found the road eventually." He glanced down at her then, and the gold of his eyes in the rain was something that had no reasonable comparison. Not candlelight, not sunlight, not anything produced by the ordinary world. It was older than that. "You were sitting in the mud in a wedding dress," he said, "alone, at midnight, in a forest where 3 men have gone missing in the past month." The last part landed differently than the rest. Missing. Missing. A pause. "Harkin's scouts. Men he sent to map these lands without my knowledge. They found more than they were looking for." She processed this. The rain intensified fractionally, pattering against the broad leaves above them, and she pulled her wrap tighter around her shoulders with her free hand. A gesture she immediately regretted because it brought her fractionally closer to him, and this close, the scent of him was a problem she had no practical solution for. Dark and cold and wild, yes, she had registered that. But beneath those layers was something she could only describe as heat, paradoxically. A deep buried warmth like embers that had been smoldering for a very long time, beneath the surface of something that presented entirely as ice. It pulled at something below her sternum, pulled and did not let go. "I'll be careful," she managed. Something passed across his face that was not quite amusement and not quite contempt. Something in the complicated territory between them, a thing his expression had clearly learned to keep in that territory permanently. "You were not being careful tonight." She could not argue with this. They broke through the tree line and the road appeared before them, familiar, rutted, leading back toward Hartwell and the chapel where candles had presumably been snuffed by now, where her mother had presumably been told, where the entire architecture of her planned future was sitting in pieces in a garden alcove, damp and unclaimed. He stopped at the forest's edge, precisely at it, as though the road beyond represented a boundary as real to him as a wall. She stopped too, and finally, their hands separated, and the cold rushed into the space his warmth had occupied so thoroughly that she almost made a sound. She turned to face him. He was watching her, with that total unnerving stillness, the gold of his eyes steady and unreadable in the rain. And she had the sudden irrational conviction that he was memorizing her, not her appearance, but something beneath it, something she herself had never managed to locate. "Theron," he said, abruptly, as though the word had escaped without authorization. She blinked. "I'm sorry?" "My name." A pause, long and weighted. "Since you didn't ask." She hadn't. She realized in this moment that she had been alone in a forest at midnight with a man, a thing, perhaps, something older and stranger than a man, and had not once thought to ask his name, had simply followed him through the dark, as though it were entirely natural, as though some part of her had recognized him before her mind had the opportunity to object. "Seline," she offered. He said nothing, but his jaw shifted, and she had the distinct impression that her name in his mouth had done something to him he had not expected and did not welcome. Go home, Seline. She took one step onto the road, then stopped, because at the edge of the forest, barely visible beyond Theron's shoulder, something moved between the trees, low to the ground, deliberate and entirely wrong. Not an animal, not the wind, something with intention behind its movement, something that had been watching and waiting and was now, with her departure, slowly beginning to advance toward him, and he had not turned around. There's something behind you. He turned, not with the startled lurch of a man caught off guard, with the slow, deliberate rotation of something that had already known, had been tracking it through the rain with senses she could not access, and had chosen to keep its back to it anyway. A demonstration, perhaps, or simply indifference to danger at a scale she could not comprehend. What emerged from the tree line was not one thing, it was three. Men, or the shapes of men, dressed in dark wool with hoods drawn low, carrying blades that caught no light because they had been blackened deliberately, professionally, by people who understood the value of arriving unseen. They moved with the coordinated patience of hunters who had done this before, spreading in a slow arc that was designed, Seline recognized with cold clarity, to cut off retreat. Her retreat, specifically. She was the one on the roadside. Theron stood between her and all three of them without appearing to have moved at all. You should run, he said to her, his voice entirely calm, the way deep water is calm, not because nothing moves within it, but because whatever moves within it is too large to disturb the surface. I'm not leaving you with... Run. Now. The largest of the three men lunged. What happened next lasted approximately 4 seconds, and rearranged everything Seline believed about the boundaries of the possible. Theron moved the way lightning moves, not quickly, not in the human sense of quickness, but with the totality of something that does not travel through space so much as simply arrive at its destination. His hand caught the man's wrist before the blade reached him, and the sound that followed was not a sound she wanted to carry forward into the rest of her life. The man dropped. The other two hesitated. That hesitation cost them. It was over before her lungs, which had apparently suspended operation at the first lunge, remembered how to function. All three were on the ground. Theron stood among them unchanged. No visible wound, no labored breath, not a single adjustment to his posture. And the gold of his eyes had shifted, darkened almost entirely to black at the outer edges, burning amber at the center. And she understood with absolute, primitive certainty that what she was looking at now was not the carefully maintained surface he had shown her on the walk through the forest. This was what lived beneath it. He turned to her slowly. The black receded. Gold returned, flooding back like sunrise, and he looked at her face, and something crossed his expression that she had not yet seen there. Something that cost him visibly. Something that he brought under control with the same ruthless efficiency he had just applied to 3 armed men. Are you hurt? No. Are you? I don't get hurt. The way he said it was not arrogance, it was simply fact, delivered with the mild weariness of someone who has made this clarification many times across a very long life. She believed him completely, which was its own kind of terrifying. Her eyes dropped to the men on the ground, breathing, all 3, she confirmed with a desperate survey. Unconscious, and would likely regret consciousness when it returned, but breathing. Who are they? He crouched beside the nearest one and examined the inside of the man's wrist with 2 fingers, reading something there she couldn't see. Collectors, he said. They work for a man named Harkin. He sends them into the forest when he wants something retrieved. He paused. Or someone. They were after you? The look he gave her over his shoulder was long and complicated. Go home, Seline. You keep saying that. You keep failing to do it. She wrapped her arms around herself against the cold and did not move, and something in her stillness, her stubborn, inconvenient stillness, made him exhale through his nose in a way that was not quite a sigh and not quite exasperation, but lived in the complicated territory between them, where everything tonight seemed to accumulate. He rose and crossed to her in 3 steps, and she held her ground. And he stopped close enough that the heat of him reached her through the rain and the cold, and every reasonable argument for stepping backward. These men will wake before dawn. When they do, they will report back to Harkin, and Harkin will want to know why they failed. And when Harkin wants answers... He paused, and his eyes moved to her face with an attention she felt physically. He looks for witnesses. The implications settled over her like cold water. So I'm in danger. You were in danger the moment you entered this forest. I am simply the reason you are still alive to be in danger. That is a uniquely unpleasant way to offer reassurance. I wasn't offering reassurance. The rain intensified. She could hear it now in the canopy behind them, a rising percussion that made the road ahead look less like a path and more like a threshold, something to be crossed or not crossed, a decision with permanence attached. Hartwell was 20 minutes down that road. Her mother was there. Her shame was there. The chapel with its extinguished candles was there. Faye was there. And here was a forest that belonged to a man with gold eyes who moved like the dark moved, without apology, without hesitation, without the particular human habit of flinching before impact. You cannot go back tonight. By dawn, Harkin's scouts will have carried word of what happened here. I need to know how far his reach extends into the village before I can guarantee your safety on that road. She looked at him. He was not asking. He was never, she was beginning to understand, asking. And where exactly would I go instead? The gold of his eyes held hers across the rain-soaked dark, and the answer he gave her was not the answer she had expected. Not cold, not commanding, not delivered with the flat authority that seemed to be his native language. It was said quietly, almost carefully, as though the words were being handled with unfamiliar caution. There is a keep, a mile north. You will be safe there. She should have said no. Every sensible, self-preserving instinct she possessed rose in immediate, unanimous objection. But then, from somewhere deep in the forest, from a darkness far thicker than the one they had walked through, came a sound that made all 3 unconscious men on the road flinch in their sleep. A howl. Long and deliberate and territorial, reverberating between the trees like a bell struck once inside a cathedral. Theron's jaw tightened, the first concession to urgency she had seen from him. That is why you cannot go back tonight. Harkin has a shifter on his payroll. A pause, weighted and deliberate. It changes everything. The keep appeared through the trees without warning, the way very old things sometimes appear, as though it had always been there and the world had simply grown around it. Stone walls the color of old bone, towers that disappeared into the low cloud above, a gate of iron that swung open at his approach without anyone touching it. She did not ask about the gate. Inside, warmth reached her immediately, fire smell, and old timber, and something faintly mineral, like deep earth. The entrance hall was large and sparsely furnished, in the way of spaces that have never needed to impress anyone, lit by torches that burned without smoking, casting everything in amber and deep shadow. A woman appeared from a side corridor, older, silver-haired, with the careful eyes of someone who has long since stopped being surprised by what the Alpha King brings through his door. She looked at Celine's ruined dress, at Celine's face, at Theron. She said nothing, which Seline found profoundly respectful. She'll need dry clothes and something warm, Theron said, and it was neither a request nor an explanation. Then he turned and looked at Seline directly, and the gold of his eyes in the firelight was something that should have been beautiful and was, instead, overwhelming. You're safe here. No one enters these walls uninvited. And the howl? His expression shifted, not into fear, never that, into something harder and more deliberate, the look of a man assembling a war quietly behind his eyes. Harkin has a shifter on his payroll. I've been tracking it for 2 weeks. Tonight confirms it's moved closer than I'd anticipated. A pause. That is what changes the timeline. What timeline? He held her gaze for 3 full seconds. The one in which this stays simple. He turned and walked deeper into the keep, and the shadows received him so completely that he disappeared before he reached the first doorway, as though the dark had simply decided he was hers again, had reclaimed him the way the forest had reclaimed ruins, quietly and without ceremony. The silver-haired woman touched Celine's elbow gently. "Come, child, the fire is warmer in the east room." Seline followed. But at the base of the stairs she stopped, because from somewhere above her, in the deep bones of the keep, she heard Theron's voice, low and controlled and speaking to someone she could not see, in a tone she had not yet heard from him. Not commanding, not cold. Worried. It lasted only a moment. Then silence reclaimed everything, and she was left standing on the stairs with the cold of the forest still in her skin and the inexplicable, treacherous warmth of him already replacing it, degree by degree, breath by breath, like a fire that had decided she was its fuel without asking her permission. Above her, a door closed, and from the forest beyond the walls, the howl came again, closer. She did not sleep. The east room was warm, and the bed was deep, and the silver-haired woman, Marin, she had offered quietly, without ceremony, had brought dry clothes and hot broth and asked nothing. All the conditions for sleep were present. Sleep did not come. Seline sat by the window and watched the rain and thought about Faye. Not about Garrett. Garrett had never truly held enough of her to leave a wound worth examining. But Faye. Faye was the person she had told her secrets to at 13. The person who had held her hair back when she was sick at 16. The person who had said, just this morning, "You will be the most beautiful bride Hartwell has ever seen," and had meant it, Seline was almost certain, even then, even knowing. That was the part that didn't fit anywhere. That was the splinter that wouldn't come free. She was still at the window when the door opened. She expected Marin. It was not Marin. Theron filled the doorframe the way he filled every space, completely, without apology, with that specific quality of presence that made rooms feel simultaneously smaller and more significant. He had changed into dry clothes, dark and plain, and his hair was still damp at the edges, and he looked at her by the window with an expression she was beginning to learn to read. The one where he was deciding how much to give her. "Harkin knows you're here." The warmth of the room became irrelevant. How? He had a second set of eyes on the road tonight, someone we didn't account for, further back in the trees, far enough to watch without being seen. He will have reported back by now. He crossed to the far side of the room and stood with his arms at his sides, watching her. "He sent word to your village, to your family." Something cold moved through her. What kind of word? The pause before his answer was precisely long enough to confirm it was bad. That you came into this forest willingly, that you sought out the Alpha King of your own accord, that you chose to be here. Another pause. That you are his. The word landed like a stone dropped into still water. The sound of it, the weight of it, spreading outward in rings she could not stop. "That's a lie." "Yes." "Then correct it. Send word back. Tell them." "If I correct it, Harkin loses his justification for what he plans to do next." His eyes held hers with that unflinching gold. "He wants this forest. He has wanted it for 2 decades. He has been waiting for a reason to move against me that his allies will accept." He let the silence do its work. A woman who wandered in and chose to stay is not that reason. But a woman manipulated, seduced, lured away from her wedding, that is a story that raises armies. That is the story he will build if I deny the one he has already started. She stared at him. "So the lie protects you." "The lie protects you. If Harkin reframes this as manipulation on my part, he has justification to send men, not to retrieve you, but to punish the village that lost you. And his men do not punish things gently." She stood and the chair scraped back, and she crossed the room with the specific energy of a person who has had everything taken from them in the single evening and has arrived, finally, at the bottom of their capacity for additional catastrophe. "I had a life," she said. "It wasn't a good one, perhaps, but it was mine. And in the space of one night, I have lost my sister, my betrothed, my home, and apparently my reputation. And now you are telling me that the only thing standing between me and an armed assault on my village is a lie that makes me yours." Something moved behind his eyes. Something that was not gold and not amber. Something darker and more unguarded than anything she had yet seen from him. "Yes," he said, "that is what I'm telling you. And what am I supposed to do with that?" He was quiet for a long moment. The fire crackled. The rain pressed against the window. The keep held its ancient breath around them, waiting. Then he said something she had not expected, something that arrived without the flat authority she had catalogued as his default, something that came from the place she had heard briefly on the stairs, the worried place, the human place. "Marry me, right now." The room stopped. "I know what I'm asking," he continued, before she could speak, before she could breathe. "I know what it costs, but if you are my wife, if the bond is real, Harkin cannot touch you, not legally, not politically. No one in these hills moves against the Alpha King's mate." She looked at his face, at the gold eyes that were not offering her romance or tenderness or the reckless, consuming love she had once, quietly, hoped for from someone. He was offering her something colder and more permanent than love. He was offering her safety, wrapped in a cage she could not yet see the dimensions of. "You don't know me." "No," he said, "but I know what is coming for you if I don't." Outside, below the keep walls, in the dark and the rain, the howl split the night wide open, and this time it was not alone. She said yes, not with the breathless surrender of a woman who had lost her mind to gold eyes and dark forests, but with the quiet, deliberate yes of a woman who had looked at the available doors and chosen the one that faced forward rather than back. It was not romantic. It was not supposed to be. Marin was summoned. 2 of Theron's men appeared from somewhere in the keep's lower levels, large, silent, with the careful deference of people who had learned long ago that questions cost more than obedience. A fire was built higher in the main hall. Marin produced a length of deep red ribbon from somewhere inside her shawl, the way older women in these hills always seemed to produce exactly what was needed, as though they had been quietly preparing for every possible catastrophe. Theron stood across from her in the firelight, and she looked at his face and thought, "I do not know you." And then, beneath that thought, quieter and more unsettling, "But something in me does." The binding was old, older than the chapel ceremony she had been hours away from performing. No words borrowed from any church, only the ribbon, looped around joined hands, and the speaking of names into fire, and the particular silence that followed that felt less like an ending and more like a door swinging open onto something vast and unmapped. When the ribbon was tied, Marin stepped back, and the 2 men lowered their eyes, and Theron looked at Seline across the space between them with an expression she could not fully read. Layered and careful, like a manuscript written in several languages over many years, the older text still visible beneath the newer. Then his thumb moved across her knuckles, once, slow, and the warmth of it traveled up her arm and into her chest and did something to the grief there, did not remove it, nothing as clean as that, but wove itself through it, the way roots grow through old stone, quietly and permanently and without asking. "It's done," he said. "It doesn't feel done." "It never does, at first." She looked at their still joined hands. "Have you done this before?" The gold of his eyes shifted. Something old moved through them. Not pain, not quite, but the specific weight of a man who has lived long enough that some questions no longer have simple answers. "No." One word, and she believed it completely, and it frightened her more than the howling outside. Marin touched her shoulder gently, and she stepped back, and the ribbon fell away, and the warmth retreated. But not entirely, not the way cold retreats when a fire is snuffed. It retreated the way tides retreat, temporarily, with the clear intention of return. Then one of the men at the door said something low and urgent in a language she didn't know, and Theron's entire bearing shifted in the space of a single breath. The careful, deliberate man she had been standing across from, gone, replaced entirely by the thing she had seen on the road, the thing that moved like lightning and felt no pain. "They're at the north wall," he said, to her specifically. "You stay with Marin. You do not open any door until I return. And if you don't return? The look he gave her across the firelight was brief and total and absolutely without comfort. I return. He moved toward the door, and she reached out. She did not plan this. Her hand simply moved, as though it had already accepted some logic her mind was still debating, and her fingers caught his wrist. He stopped, looked down at her hand, then up at her face. Theron. Something crossed his expression, raw and fast and gone before she could name it. I know, he said. He didn't explain what he knew. She didn't ask. Because somehow, standing in the firelight of a keep she had not known existed 6 hours ago, wearing borrowed clothes, bound by red ribbon to a man with gold eyes and a pulse that beat too slowly for anything mortal, she understood that he meant all of it. The door closed behind him. Maren guided her gently away from the door and toward the fire, and Seline let herself be guided and sat and pressed her hand flat against her sternum where the warmth still lived, where it had taken up residence without permission and was clearly not prepared to negotiate terms. From outside came sounds she catalogued without wanting to. A crash, a howl cut suddenly short, the particular silence that follows violence when the violence has been total. Then nothing. Then footsteps. His. She knew them already, that unhurried rhythm, returning along the stone corridor. The door opened. He stood in the frame with rain in his hair and blood on his hands. Not his own, his expression confirmed before she could ask, and he looked at her by the fire and something in his jaw released, as though he had been holding it clenched since the moment he walked out. It's over. Harkin? His men, and the shifter. A pause, brief, deliberate. He won't be sending another one. He crossed to the fire and held his hands toward the flame, and she watched his profile in the light. The severity of it, the exhaustion moving beneath the surface like weather beneath ice. Harken himself will come next, when he hears what happened to them. When? Soon, he paused. But not tonight. She watched him at the fire and thought about the ribbon, about the word wife sitting somewhere in her chest, new and strange and far too large for the space available. What happens now? He turned his head and looked at her, and the gold of his eyes in the firelight was, for just one unguarded moment, not cold, not calculating, not the look of a predator running probability assessments. It was something else entirely. Something that looked, dangerously and inconveniently, like relief. Now, he said, you sleep, and tomorrow we prepare. For Harkin. For everything. She held his gaze across the fire, and for the first time since she had sat in the mud in a ruined dress and believed her world had ended, she did not feel like something discarded. She felt like something found. She slept. Deeply, without dreams, which surprised her. What did not surprise her was waking to the sound of voices, low and urgent, carrying through the stone walls of the keep with the particular clarity of an argument being conducted just below the register of shouting. She dressed quickly in Maren's borrowed clothes and followed the sound down the corridor to a door left fractionally open. She should not have listened. She listened. She cannot stay here. A voice she didn't recognize, male, careful, with the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Harkin. Theron was quiet for long enough that she thought he might refuse. Then, he has been accumulating territory for 20 years, buying sheriffs, bribing lords, pressing smaller clans until they fold. This forest is the last significant land in the region he does not control. He paused. He has wanted it for a decade. He has not taken it because he knows what I am. And what exactly are you? He turned from the window then and looked at her fully, and she held the weight of those gold eyes without flinching because she had decided, somewhere between sleep and this gray morning, that flinching was a luxury she could no longer afford. You already know. I want to hear you say it. Something moved through his expression, something that was almost warm. Alpha King, he said, the last of the old bloodline in this region. Shifter, old enough that the distinction between legend and biography has become unclear. How old? Older than your village. She absorbed this. Outside a bird called once, sharp and brief, and the fog moved against the window like something breathing. And the bond, she said. The ribbon last night, is it real? In the way that matters? The pause before his answer was the longest yet. It is real. He held her gaze. What that means, what it becomes, is not predetermined. The bond is a beginning, not an ending. That's a remarkably honest answer. I find dishonesty inefficient. Despite everything, the fog, the threat beyond the walls, the impossible strangeness of standing in a keep she had not known existed 24 hours ago, she felt the corner of her mouth move. He noticed. She could tell by the way his jaw shifted, by the fractional change in his breathing, by the gold of his eyes, doing that thing where they deepened without warning into something that had no name in any ordinary language. Then Marin appeared in the doorway, and the moment sealed itself over like ice over water, present beneath the surface, invisible from above. My lord, a rider at the gate, Harkin's colors. The warmth in his eyes became something else entirely. Bring him to the hall. Marin disappeared. Theron moved past Seline toward the door, and as he passed her, his hand found the small of her back, brief, automatic, barely a touch. And then he was already 3 steps ahead, and she was standing in the empty study with her hand pressed to the place where his had been, her heart conducting itself with complete disregard for her composure. She followed him to the hall. The rider was young, mud-splashed, with the deliberately blank expression of a man delivering a message he has been told not to editorialize. He held out a sealed letter. Theron broke it open in a single motion and read. His face revealed nothing. He folded the letter once, set it on the table. Harkin offers terms, he said to the room. He wants the forest. He wants it deeded to him by the new moon. A pause. In exchange, he will not move against the village. Hartwell? Seline said. He's threatening Hartwell? He's threatening everyone you know. His gold eyes found hers across the hall. It's well done, actually. He knows I cannot be threatened directly, so he threatens what is near me instead. The rider shifted his weight. And your answer, my lord? Theron looked at Seline. Not quickly, not the brief strategic assessment she might have expected. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in the forest, with that total attention that saw through every layer she had constructed between herself and the world. Then he looked back at the rider. Tell Harkin, he said, that the Alpha King declines. The rider went pale. And tell him, Theron continued, something shifting in his voice to something colder and far older, something that made the torches in the hall gutter simultaneously. That if a single person in that village is touched, I will remind him why this forest has belonged to my bloodline for 3 centuries. The rider left at speed. Silence settled over the hall. And then Seline felt it, for the first time, undeniably, impossible to rationalize away, a warmth in her chest that was not her own, a steadiness that flowed from somewhere outside her ribcage, from the direction of the man standing at the head of the hall, with gold eyes and 3 centuries of power sitting quietly in his bones. The bond. Real, he had said. She pressed her hand flat against her sternum and said nothing, and Theron, across the hall, did the same. Harkin came at dusk, not with riders, not with a letter. He came with 40 men on horseback, torches burning against the failing light, arranged in a line beyond the keep's outer wall, with the patient theatricality of a man who has rehearsed this moment and intends to enjoy it. Seline stood at the upper window and watched them fill the road and felt something cold and clarifying move through her. The specific calm that arrives sometimes when fear becomes too large to sustain and the body simply releases it, accepts what is coming, decides to meet it standing. Theron appeared at her shoulder. "Stay inside." "No." He looked at her. She looked back. "I am your wife," she said. "Whatever that means in practice, whatever this bond is or becomes, it means I do not hide in a room while you stand at a gate alone." Something moved through his expression. Not argument, not the flat authority she had come to expect. Something that looked, briefly and devastatingly, like gratitude. The kind that has no comfortable home in a man who has been alone for 3 centuries and has forgotten how to receive it. He said nothing. He let her follow. They stood together at the gate as Harkin crossed from his line. He was smaller than she had imagined, compact and gray-haired, with the careful eyes of a merchant and the bearing of a man who considered violence a tool rather than a preference. He looked at Theron with the wariness of someone who has spent years calculating odds. Then his eyes moved to Seline, and something shifted in his expression that made her skin pull tight. "The bride," Harkin said. "How convenient that you appear at his side so willingly. One might almost believe you chose this." A pause. Deliberate, blade sharp. "Or one might believe you were persuaded." The implication was elegant and precise. Not that she had been taken by force, but that she had been manipulated, seduced away from her wedding by something older and more powerful than she could resist. It was a story designed to generate pity and outrage in equal measure, and she recognized it immediately as exactly what Theron had warned her about. "I was not persuaded," Seline said, her voice carrying across the space between them with a steadiness that surprised even herself. "I walked into this forest. I spoke his name before a fire. Whatever you tell your allies, Harkin, I chose this, freely, with full knowledge of what I was choosing." Something moved across Harkin's face, a recalculation, swift and cold. "How very convenient for him. How very inconvenient for you," Theron said beside her, and the temperature around them dropped, and Harkin's horse shifted and pulled and had to be controlled with both hands. "I have 40 men, Alpha King." "I'm aware of your men," Theron said. "I'm aware of all 40 of them. I'm aware of their names and their families and the villages they come from." A pause, vast and deliberate. "I want them to go home to those villages. That choice belongs to you." Harkin's eyes moved between them, calculating, reassessing, finding the geometry of the situation less favorable than he had arranged it in his mind. Then they landed on Seline with a narrowing that was not defeat. "The girl has family in Hartwell," he said. "A mother, a sister, properties that could be subject to dispute." The threat was elegant. She felt it land in her chest like a blade finding the specific gap between bones it was designed for. And then she felt something else. A warmth, sudden and vast and not entirely her own, flooding upward from the bond, from the place in her chest where Theron's presence had taken up residence, and with it something she had never felt before. Something that moved through her veins like light through water, like heat through iron. She looked at her hands, a faint luminescence, gold at the edges, gone in a breath. What was that? Seline. She looked up. Theron was watching her with an expression she had never seen on his face, stripped entirely of its careful management, entirely open, the gold of his eyes blazing in the dusk with something that looked like recognition and wonder, and a 3-century-old loneliness finally finding its answer. "You're not entirely human," he said. "You never were." The words rearranged everything. Harkin moved. His hand raised, the signal she understood, and at the gate's edge 2 of his men surged forward. Theron moved to intercept, and she reached for him, and the moment her hand found his arm, the warmth detonated. Not metaphorically. The sky above the keep cracked with a sound like the world splitting at a seam, and the light that poured from it was gold. The specific impossible gold of Theron's eyes, the same gold she had briefly seen at her own hands. And it hit the ground between them and Harkin's men like a wall being dropped from a great height. The horses screamed, the men fell back. Harkin sat very still in his saddle. The light faded slowly, like a breath released, and Seline stood at the gate, with Theron's hand now gripping hers, and the warmth between them so vast she could not find the boundary between her own heartbeat and his, could not find the seam, could not determine where she ended and the bond began. She had stopped trying. "Leave," Theron said to Harkin. One word, carrying 3 centuries of patience that had entirely, finally, expired. Harkin looked at the scorched earth between his men and the gate. He looked at Seline, at whatever was visible in her face, whatever the bond had put there, the gold that had not entirely faded from her eyes. He looked at Theron. He turned his horse. 40 men followed without a word, without looking back, moving down the road in the failing light until the torches were only distant points, and then nothing, swallowed by the dark at the forest's edge. Silence. The keep exhaled around them. Seline stood in the gateway, with the warmth of the bond filling every chamber of her chest, and Theron's hand still locked around hers, and she looked at him, truly looked, without the fear of the first night, without the careful self-protection of every moment since, and she saw it all. The weight of 3 centuries, the loneliness of something built for permanence in a world of temporary things, the gold eyes that had seen everything and chosen, inexplicably and specifically and irrevocably, to see her. "I'm not entirely human," she said. "No." "Were you going to tell me?" "I was waiting for you to feel it yourself." His thumb moved across her knuckles. "I didn't want you to accept it because I told you it was true. I wanted you to know it because you felt it." She looked at their joined hands, at the place where the gold had bloomed at her skin's edge like dawn arriving early. "What am I?" He lifted her hand and pressed his mouth to her knuckles, not gently, not briefly, but with a gravity that made her chest collapse entirely. And when he raised his eyes to hers over her hand, the gold in them was burning and certain and done pretending to be ice. "Mine," he said, "as I am yours." The bond answered. It answered in her bones, in her blood, in the gold warmth that spread from their joined hands outward through every part of her that had ever been cold. And there had been so much cold, so much careful endurance of insufficient warmth. And it filled all of it, every hollow, every wound, every place that Garrett had never troubled himself to reach. She stepped forward. He received her without surprise, as though he had been waiting, had always, across 3 impossible centuries, been waiting, and his arms closed around her with the finality of something that has found the shape it was built for. Above them, the first stars appeared through breaking cloud, and in the keep behind them, Marin smiled at no one in particular, and set a second place at the table. 3 months later, the forest was gold. Not the wild, accidental gold of autumn, but the deep, intentional gold of a world that has decided, finally, to reflect what lives at its center. The leaves had turned slowly over the weeks, as though the trees themselves were marking something, acknowledging a shift in the order of things that went deeper than seasons. Seline stood at the window of the study, her study now, filled with her books alongside his maps, and watched the morning move through the canopy, and felt the bond warm in her chest like a second heartbeat, steady and permanent and entirely at home. She had learned, in 3 months, what she was. The bloodline was old, older than the village, older than her mother's careful genealogies that stopped suspiciously 3 generations back, as though someone had decided that was far enough. A dormant line. Shifter heritage so diluted by generations of human marriage that it had expressed itself in nothing more than an unusual calm under pressure and an inexplicable ease in deep forest. Until the night she had walked into his forest. Until the bond had found the ember and breathed on it. She did not shift, not the way Theron shifted, not yet, perhaps not ever in the same form. But the gold came when she called it now. Warmth that was also light. That was also power, that moved through her when she and Theron were close and doubled when they touched, and had, on one memorable occasion, caused every candle in the main hall to ignite simultaneously without anyone striking a flame. Marin had applauded. Hartwell had been complicated. Her mother had come to the keep 3 weeks after the night of Harkin's retreat, escorted by Aldrich, who had delivered the invitation with the careful neutrality of a man who had long since made his peace with the Alpha King's choices. Her mother had stood in the entrance hall and looked at Theron for a very long time, and then looked at Seline and said, with the pragmatic economy of a woman who had survived considerable disappointment, "Well, you chose better than I expected," which was, from her mother, essentially an aria of approval. Faye had not come. Seline had sent no invitation to Faye. That wound was still new enough to require careful handling, still present beneath the surface of daily life like a splinter not yet ready to be removed. She thought about her sister sometimes, in the gray early mornings before Theron woke. Thought about forgiveness as a thing that could be true and distant simultaneously, a destination rather than a present condition. She was in no hurry. She had time now. That was perhaps the strangest and most beautiful thing about the life she had stumbled into through a garden alcove and a ruined dress. The spaciousness of it. The sense that she was no longer moving toward a fixed point chosen by someone else, no longer measuring herself against an arrangement she had never quite fit. She was simply here, in a keep that smelled of old stone and timber and him, in a life that was unmapped and therefore entirely hers to chart. Arms came around her from behind, unhurried, certain, the embrace of a man who has learned, slowly and somewhat reluctantly, that he prefers the world when she is in it. Theron pressed his mouth to her temple and said nothing, because he had learned also that she thought better in silence and that offering her silence was its own form of devotion. She leaned back into him and felt the bond hum between them, warm and constant and bilateral, flowing both directions with equal ease now. None of the one-sided overwhelm of those first uncertain weeks. She could feel his steadiness. He had told her, once, in the careful way he told her things that cost him, that he could feel her warmth. That it was, he said, with the understatement of a man still learning the vocabulary of vulnerability, not unwelcome. She had not pressed him. She had simply taken his hand. "Aldrich's scouts returned this morning," he said against her hair. "And?" "Harkin has left the region. Moved his holdings north." A pause. "He won't return." She absorbed this. The gold morning moved through the trees, and the birds continued, and the bond continued, and the keep around them was solid and permanent and entirely unimpressed by any of it, having stood through far larger histories than theirs. "Is it over?" "This part," he said. "Yes." She turned in his arms to face him and looked up at the gold eyes that had been the first impossible thing she had seen on the worst night of her life, and thought about the version of herself who had sat in the mud in a ruined dress and believed that this specifically, was what ruin felt like. She had been wrong. Ruin was what came before. What came after was this: morning light and old stone and a man who had 3 centuries of careful solitude and had spent 3 months slowly, deliberately learning to put it down. Who looked at her now with eyes that no longer managed their warmth, that let it show, fully, the way fire shows when it has stopped pretending to be embers. "You're thinking loudly again," he said. "I'm thinking that I walked into a forest in a ruined dress and somehow ended up here." "And?" She lifted her hand and pressed her palm flat against his chest, against the slow, impossible heartbeat that she now knew as well as her own. "And I would walk into every forest," she said, "every dark, every wrong night, if it ended here." Something broke open in his face, finally and completely. The last careful wall, the last managed distance, and what was underneath was not the terrible ancient power she had first encountered at the tree line. It was something far more devastating. It was simply a man who had waited a very long time to be found. "It ends here," he said, "and it begins here." He kissed her, not for the first time, but with the specific quality of a beginning. Slow and certain and entirely without the guardedness that had characterized every earlier approach. She felt the gold rise in her chest and merge with his and flow outward through the room, warm and luminous and, from somewhere outside the window, in the trees, in the forest that had always, always been theirs. The forest answered. Light moved through the canopy in long gold ribbons, and the keep was warm, and the bond between them was real and chosen and permanent in the way that only things freely accepted can ever be truly permanent. Not a cage, never a cage. A home.